Testing. Testing. One.
President of our Rabbinical Council of America, a man who is well known to all of us for his energy, his devotion, and splendid accomplishments on behalf of the Rabbinical Council of America. It is my pleasure to present to you Rabbi Theodore Adams.
כבוד מורנו הרב, חברים וחברות, we've gathered here this evening to discuss a subject very vital to each of us who functions in the active rabbinate. We are all aware of the multitudinous and varied activities and responsibilities that are those that have to be carried today by the active rabbi. It reminds me of the story that is told in the name of the Chofetz Chaim Zechron Livrocho. He told this in another connection, that once a man was along the road carrying a very heavy burden on his shoulders, and another man drove by with a wagon and asked him to get onto the wagon so that he could take him to his destination. And during the entire trip, the wayfarer carried the burden on his shoulder as he did while he was walking on the road. And so the Balagola turned to him and said, "Why don't you put your burden down on the bottom of the wagon?" Whereupon he answered him, "It's kind enough for you to take me. You have to carry my burden too." We have the same problem in the rabbinate, of course, that we carry burdens that are beyond our being able to carry from time to time. And yet, if we look back upon the origin of these burdens that we carry, we find that we've inherited them from years gone by, from the first leaders in Jewish life, two who have been compared to each other by our sages, two who have the same attributes, two who have been considered great, Moshe Rabbeinu and Shmuel Hanavi. Moshe v'Aaron b'Choanov u'Shmuel b'Korei Shmo. Two great leaders, both of them carrying the same burdens and having the same multitude of responsibilities. Of Shmuel Hanavi we find, when people came to look for him, they asked, "Hayesh bozeh horoeh?" Where do we find the spiritual leader, the Novi? And they were answered, Kevoachem hu'ir, kein timtzu no so. Just go into the city and you'll find him there. Take a look at any part of communal activities, whether it is the spiritual, the prophet, the one who teaches, the one who's active in civic life, in human relations, in interreligious activities. You will find him there. Just kevoachem ho'ir. Come into the town. Come into the city. And the same thing we found about Moshe Rabbeinu. When Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law Yisro came He saw all of the many things that he did, the multitude of responsibilities and of duties. Moshe Rabbeinu had to be the one who was mekabel from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He had to transmit to the Israelites. He had to send spies. He had to negotiate with foreign governments. He had to send ambassadors. Multitude of responsibilities and duties. And we find that Hosei Moshe gave him an answer. And the Brisker Rav Zechreinu Livrocha, Reb Velvel, interprets this beautifully. He says, here the Posuk says, Kol asher hu oso. And when he gives him the eitzah, he says, V'ato sechse, and gives him an eitzah only about one thing. Because he says that Moshe had amongst his responsibilities three major ones, which you find. One is the lidrosh, lishol mipi hagvuro. Moshe had to receive from HaKadosh Baruch Hu the instruction. Second, loidia lo'om chukei haTorah, v'yodati es chukei Elokim. He had to transmit what he heard from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to the people. And then he had the third responsibility, lishpoit ben ish li'ochiv, v'shafati ben ish, uvein re'ehu. He had to be the one who was involved in every phase of human relations. He had to be the one who paskin the din Torah. He had to decide whether people should do this or do that, whether this was permitted or that was permitted, how far we could go in our relationship, how far we could not go, what we should do and when we should do it. All the phases of sociological endeavor, that was also his responsibility. This also, as I said before, was Shmuel Hanavi's responsibility. What did the people try to do? They wanted to take some of it away from him. And the people came to Shmuel Hanavi and they asked him, give us a king. Give us a king who shall be the shofet, who shall take care of these administrative problems, who shall take care of the political problems, who shall take care of the human relations, the civil rights, the interreligious, the intercommunal. And this was actually also, says the Brisker Rov, what Yisroi told Moshe. The first two things, when he saw all that he had to do, the first two things he admitted no one can take away from Moshe. No one can hear me pi hagvura, and no one can teach what Moshe could teach. But the other responsibilities, that one, the atos sechse, for that you can pick others. You can elect, you can choose. Mipi hagvuro, it's true. But choose people who will take that part of the burden off of your shoulders, where you do not have to involve yourself in those day-to-day responsibilities which are not your problem, which must not be your problem, which takes away time from your learning, time from your speaking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and time from your teaching, which is so vital and so necessary. We've come tonight, dear friends, to discuss the rabbinate. But we've come also to hear a man who epitomizes to us all of these various aspects and the multitude of responsibilities which hang so heavily over him and weigh him down, and which he carries on his shoulder. Even when someone gives him a ride, he still carries them on his shoulder. We hope the day will come when v'atos sechse, when there shall be sufficient religious leadership in America and in the world, which will be able to take this responsibility from him, so that which he is so wonderfully able to do, and which only he can do, the sitting and learning with his hasmode, with the genius of the mind which God has endowed him, lidrosh, and v'hoidati, to transmit to us the chukei haTorah. This is what we admire him for. This is what we would love to see him best able to concentrate on. And I know he himself is hopeful for the day when there will be that responsible leadership that will take over these heavy duties and administer them properly with dignity and with honor. Dear friends, it is my privilege and my honor to present to you that man who in our generation represents the Moshe and the Shmuel of old, the man who has the genius and the knowledge to hear actually God's word in its purest form and to transmit it to us in that pure form. Reinu v'Rabbeinu, Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rabbi Adams. We all know that there is an halachic term, lishmo. It's quite hard to find an equivalent term in another language which should convey to us the same conceptual content. The literal translation of this term would be "for her name," or whenever we are ready to change the gender from the feminine to the masculine, lishmei, we would say "for his name." However, the literal translation does not do justice to the conceptual content of this term. Basically, the term lishmo denotes, I'm trying to define it halachically. It's not a drush approach that I'm employing now. The halachic term denotes purposeful action. Or in other words, the awareness on the part of the doer of the objective or the goal he is pursuing by engaging in a particular kind of action. For instance, the law of lishmo. Is it all right?
Yeah, they can't hear us. They're in trouble.
The law of lishmo. Now it's better? No? It's not working. Yes.
Not working. It's working.
Not sure. Where's that stand? Where's that
Rabbi,
stand?
would you be more comfortable in this chair?
Stop it. What's the difference? This chair, yeah, I mean a lower chair.
A little higher.
It's a place to keep the papers and the skeleton.
Not high. Tell him it's too high.
Where is that stand?
Right on here. Come on, this is
No, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't work.
Yes, it's not too pleasant.
It's not comfortable?
Of course not. Instead of looking at the people, I look at the mark. For instance, I can talk. It's impossible. I cannot have this in front of me.
Put it back here again. Try it once
You have to
more.
make it
Just
loud.
bend it down. That's all. Bend it down. Maybe work this way.
It's too high, sure. There's no need of me.
No.
Want me to hold it?
It's an idea. It's no good. It's no good. What can you do? Hmm? So what should you do? It's too hard.
Can it be bent over?
Wait, let's
Step a little higher, it'll be easier.
go up to sit higher.
Yes.
This
You
see
have a
this
higher
one?
chair.
For instance, you said before, let me just recapitulate this, what I said. We spoke about the problem of lishmo, the halachic term of lishmo. And we have developed the thought that actually what this term denotes is purposeful action. Action related to a certain objective. The awareness on the part of the doer of the objective he is pursuing through engaging in a particular kind of action. For instance, the law of lishmo concerning get, everybody knows about the requirement of lishmo for the writing of a get, requires that the latter, in the get, be written and signed with reference to the final phase of the divorce procedure, namely the termination of the marital bond which united two specific individuals. And the get must be written with a special intention concerning a particular male and a particular female. You know very well that the lishmoing get consists of two strata. First stratum means Lishem Gerushin at the first level. At the second level, this is a general intention for the purpose of terminating a marital relationship. Then at the second level, for the purpose of terminating a marital relationship between two specific individuals. A bill of divorce which was not intended expressly for the purpose of actual severance of the marital relationship, or which was prepared for two other individuals, is null and void. The general as well the individual element, L'Shem Gerushin and L'Shem Eisu Ish V'Isho, must never be omitted. This kind of lishmo is indispensable. I happened to study Gittin last semester. It is quite interesting that the law requiring lishmo applies to the following actions in halacha. First, the writing of a get. Second, the writing and the raising of Parsha Seiter, the scriptural section of Megillah Seiter. Third, the preparing of the parchment and the writing on this parchment of the text of Sefer Torah Tefillin Mezuzah, Stam. Fourth, the spinning of the yarn of this. Perhaps lishmo also applies to matzah. It's halachically questionable, but if there is a requirement of lishmo for the baking of matzah, it will be subsumed by me under the fourth category, the spinning of the yarn for tzitzis. It means the action, the preparatory action for a certain mitzvah. Shifting the idea of lishmo from a formal halachic to a symbolic experiential level or perspective, I would say that these four groups, consisting Get, Parsha Seiter, Stam, and Tzitzis and Matzah, that these four groups could be classified, could be reduced to two, and classified under two categories. Not halachic categories, but philosophical categories, but experientially and symbolically important. The whole group, the fourfold group of lishmo, could be classified under the category of the tragic and the category of the exalted. Whenever man finds himself entangled in an unalterable and absurd, hostile situation that necessitates action which under other circumstances would be considered unwarranted, and which per se, action which per se runs contrary to the divine scheme of creation, but sometimes such action is required of man. I wouldn't say required, is compelled to engage in such action. Then the action is tragic, because it contradicts in some manner the divine plan or scheme of creation. And this action must never be initiated just incidentally. Tragic action can never be initiated incidentally, at random, but must be planned and executed according to plans. Tragic action is initiated by men who finds it impossible to surmount heroically a state of chaos and desolation, and is pushed to a decision involving moral conflict. And whenever he is forced to reach such a decision and to take action, he must engage into this action with a clear knowledge of what it implies and fully aware of the consequences of this action. Therefore, the dissolution of a divinely ordained community, which is the marital institution, the marriage institution, which is basically a demonic destructive gesture. You know of many Memorah Chazal who describe the tragedy in divorce. It's not just a tragedy in sociological terms, according to Chazal, it's more than that. It transcends sociological and psychological bounds and reaches into the metaphysical. When Chazal express themselves, Kolam Garish, Ishtei, Afil Mizbeach, Meredol Admois, even the altar cries. Chazal wanted to indicate or to emphasize that the tragedy is of metaphysical magnitude. And that's why it's tragic, basically. Man basically is a tragic being. And the tragic is an inner quality, I would say an existential quality, deeply rooted in his I consciousness. And this tragic quality, which expresses itself in the plunging into the depth of unheroic, inferior powers, in his not being able to exercise his heroic capacity, must be experienced in all its grisly horror. And if his action is due to a lower state, at which he loses a sense of human responsibility and hence is forced to act as a weakling, then he must have full comprehension of what he is actually destroying and what he is engaged. And this is basically what Chazal, in formal halachic terms, call Lishmo. Let a husband who is determined to break up a great union which transcends the bounds of sociological and psychological utility be aware of his decision and act accordingly. Let him give specific instructions to the scribe, not just because he passed by the house or the office of the scribe and he found a ready-made get, so he suddenly decided to divorce his wife. Let him give specific instructions to the scribe and to the witnesses to write and to sign the get expressly for the purpose of destroying something great, beautiful, and fascinating. In one word, the Lishmo of get to Megillah Seder means that any violent outburst of destructive energy on the part of man be an intentional, conscious performance, not an incidental occurrence. Let the man who acts under the impact of demonic, sinful, suggestive powers grasp the implications of what he is doing and not attempt to find refuge in escapist philosophy which glosses over the tragic and covers the uneven and rough surface of reality with a veneer of sweetness and softness. And basically, if we study others, if we explore other sectors of Yehadus, we'll find that Yehadus has always emphasized that man should be aware of the tragic in his life, of what the mystics call the dark night of the soul. He should not close his eyes to this element in human existence. He should not close his eyes to the dark night of the human soul. And this philosophy that a man should meet the tragic with sharpened senses and exalted spiritual sensitivity and enhanced perceptibility lies at the root, of course philosophically, of many of the laws pertaining to death, burial, and mourning. Christianity always wanted to convince itself and to persuade the world that there is no evil in creation. Yehadus never denied the existence of evil. It said there is evil, even though you don't know why. The evil is a great mystery, mysterium magnum. We cannot comprehend its origin, its rationality, and the purpose. But willy-nilly we must admit that evil does exist, and since it exists, it's a fact, and the fact should never be denied. But we have to learn how to cope with evil and to raise evil to a great moral force, or rather not evil, suffering to a great moral force. However, the other two groups of Lishmo, Sefer Torah, Tzitzis, Matzeh, are to be classified under a different category. And as I said, this category is the one of the exalted. When man, in contrast with the performance I just described, with the tragic performance, engages in a gesture which is spiritually creative. When man sanctifies and hallows creation, when he invests meaningless objects with meaning, purposeless things with purposiveness, and insignificant events with directedness. Whenever the human being succeeds in capturing the centers of human creative activity, and with a higher, sharper intuition of reality, begins to act, he must also act in full knowledge of his greatness and his exaltedness. The Torah required of man to act in full knowledge of his weakness and tragedy, and also in full knowledge of his grandeur and magnificence. One must not write a Sefer Torah incidentally, not being cognizant of the very essence of the miraculous act which transforms ordinary things, such as parchment and ink, into vehicles of God's word, into Kedusha entities. It's a miraculous, creative performance. After all, the source of Kedusha, Yahadus kept on saying, is not transcendental, with the exception perhaps of Shabbos. The human creative act is responsible for the realization of the idea of the holy, for endowing low states of being with sanctity. It's the human act and only the human act. All holidays are hallowed by men. The Kaddish Yisrael Vazmanim, you know very well. The Beis Hamikdash, the Rabbi, the sanctuary is invested with Kedusha only when Beth Din has decided to consecrate the area as Beis Hamikdash, Emisifim Al-Ir Va'azoris. All sacerdotal holy objects, vessels, attain their status only through human action. Ish ki yagdish as basic Kaddish. And if it is human action which consecrates, it's human action which sanctifies, if it's human action which allows, then the action must be purposeful, intentional. And the one who initiates this type of action should be fully aware of what he's doing. Mechanical action, not guided by the colorful vision of the ultimate end, not motivated by the urge for a better, more sublime and dedicated life, cannot engender Kedusha, and also desecrates the experience of the tragic. Hence, Lishmo, concentration upon the purposiveness and significance of a particular performance, the special intention, the knowledge and appreciation of what is happening are indispensable for both, for the tragic and for the exalted. In short, every outburst of violent, destructive energy requires intentional action, and every outburst of intense creative energy requires intentional action. The term writing a Sefer Torah, Ksiva Sefer Torah, has halachically, and I am emphasizing, underlining, this this adverb, a twofold connotation. First of all, ksiva sefer Torah refers to the physical act of writing the text of the Pentateuch on parchment in accordance with the laws of Stam. Second, it's very strange, but this is not an agadic homiletical term, it's a basic halachic term. The teaching of Torah to another person, the upbringing of the young in accordance with halachic precepts, is considered al pi halacha an act which is identical with writing a Sefer Torah. Scholars are called Sofrim. The Gemara in Kedushin already raised this question. Why are they called Sofrim? The Gemara gives another interpretation. But basically, Yerushalmi corroborates it, because the scholar also writes. The difference between the scribe and the scholar is just related to the type, to the how he performs. What is the background, and what kind of ink he uses. Moshe Rabbeinu, Chazal say in Sefer, at the end of the first pairing, was called Safro Rabbo de Yisrael, the great scribe in Israel. And if Moshe was called Safro Rabbo de Yisrael, it's not because Moshe was a scribe, he was actually a scribe, because he himself wrote Sefer Torah. This wouldn't be such an exalted title which Chazal bestowed upon Moshe. Safra Rabbi de Israel applied to Moshe had the connotation of the great teacher in Israel, not the great scribe in Israel. He's still known under the name Moshe Rabbeinu. As a matter of fact, I already emphasized it. The second connotation is not just a metaphor, a nice pictorial phrase, but is halachically meaningful. Let me explain it. The halacha has endowed the Jew with the sanctity of a Sefer Torah. The Jew, al pidin, according to halacha, is endowed with the sanctity of a Sefer Torah, because he is a living vehicle of God's word, more than the parchment or ink. And you know all the Gemara in Shabbos, kol ha'imid b'shas misase shel adam kosher, shel adam Yisrael, not even kosher is required. Chayiv l'krei olav, or le'mozedeme l'sefer Torah shenisraf. His memory is the symbolic scroll in which God's word is written. Departing from this premise, it becomes quite obvious that the teacher who implants this type of knowledge in the disciple, who imbues him with the divine halacha, who molds his thinking and fashions his feelings, is the genuine scribe. But of course, he creates not a Sefer Torah on parchment, but a living Sefer Torah. Now, if the art of teaching has been halachically equated with the writing of a Sefer Torah, then the inference is immediate. Now you understand why I started my introduction with an exposition of the term Lishma. It's not just due to the fact that I delved quite deeply in the halachic problems of Lishma last year, while I sat here in Masechet Gittin, but because Lishma is required not only to the performance of the scribe, but also with regard to the educational gesture, to teaching. Teaching must be done lishmo. Of course, if you teach a girl, I happen to teach boys. It's lishmei or lishmom, I don't know. Sometimes I have the impression that it's lishmo of one student. Right. This is when I am in a pessimistic mood. When I'm optimistic, I think it's lishmom of 75 students. Of course, this depends upon the students, not upon me. In other words, teaching must not be a mechanical performance, no matter how skillful and proficient. Teaching is a teleological performance related to a great objective, which the teacher wants to attain. In a word, teaching requires lishmo. And teaching shalei lishmo is just as void and null, as worthless, as a Sefer Torah which was written shalei lishmo. It's appeared the Gemara in Gittin that one scribe appeared before Rabbi and said he wrote the Sefer Torah shalei lishmo. So Rabbi said he should forfeit his salary. And a teacher who actually performs, who engages in the educational gesture shalei lishmo, should not receive a salary either. This would solve quite a problem for day schools and yeshivas. Yeah. What is the definition of lishmo as far as the educational gesture is concerned? It is simple to write a Sefer Torah lishmo, l'shem kedusha Sefer Torah. But what kind of intention should I have in mind while I engage in this educational performance? Of course, the answer is a simple one. Teaching is a teleological performance, striving to achieve a goal, please listen carefully, and believing that this goal is within the reach of the teacher. For every teleological performance is related to both, to an idea and an ideal. Whoever engages in purposive action is striving to attain something, to realize a certain goal, to reach a certain objective, or to simply to take a vision and transform it into a reality. He is guided by two factors, I would say, by an idea and an ideal. What's the difference between these two terms, between an idea and an ideal? I must, in order to explain it, I must paraphrase a Platonic maxim from Timaeus. And paraphrasing this maxim, I would say, the idea, it's almost Platonic language. The idea represents what is, which is capital. It's Platonic language, and is not subject to the process of becoming, while the ideal is that which is always becoming and never is capital, and never is. The ideal pursues a vision. The idea is related to a fact. In other words, the idea is a product of a logical judgment predicating being of something, that something exists, that something is, that something is a part of the order of facticity. It is related to the factual, while the ideal is a result of a normative judgment, not asserting actual being, but anticipating desired being, something which is desired. not affirming that something is real, but demanding that something become real. While the act of predication of the general logical judgment employs the auxiliary verb is, as A is B, as the copula between the subject and the object, the assertion in the normative judgment avails itself of the ought to be as its medium through which an ideal is set up, and human duty vis-a-vis this ideal is postulated and formulated. Any action, it is self-evident, which is of teleological nature, is directed toward an ideal, telos, and is basically the human response, a result of the human response to normative pressure. However, at the root of this purposive performance lies an idea. What is the idea? Affirming a factual state of affairs, namely that the realization of the ideal set up by man or by the norm is humanly possible. You have an idea. Pressure. However, at the root of this purposive performance lies an idea. What is the idea? Affirming a factual state of affairs, namely that the realization of the ideal set up by man or by the norm is humanly possible. You have an ideal. For instance, as rabbis, we want to convert a community or bring the community closer to Yahadus. I would say it's not an idea because it does not predicate of the being or facticity that this state exists already, because if this state were in existence, we wouldn't need, there would be no need for us to simply to undertake it. But simply it is a desired state. It ought to happen. It must happen. It should happen. It's a norm. It's an ideal. It's a vision. It's a vision on a far horizon, of course, beckoning to me, alluring us. But however, it is just a vision. It's an ideal. But however, you cannot approach the ideal, you cannot engage in any action directed toward attaining this ideal unless you are assured of something. And this assurance is indispensable, and this assurance is unavoidable. Without this assurance, no ideal can be set up, and certainly a human being cannot simply concentrate or focus his attention on this ideal. The assurance that the ideal is subject to realization. Every norm, every mitzvah, every duty, every obligation is and must be accompanied by an assurance that it is realizable, that the human being may cope with this norm, and he has the capacity for fulfilling it. The old maxim by Kant, du kannst, weil du musst, you can because you must, could be reversed. Du musst, weil du kannst, you must because you can do it. What does it mean? It means, what do you mean, you must? If there's normative pressure, I feel I am under obligation, I feel I have to pursue a certain goal, I am restless, I am driven by an inner force, I am overcome by almost superhuman power, which drives me toward action, toward the realization of a great ideal. So I have to be assured that my efforts are not in vain, that this ideal is subject to realization. And basically, Moshe Rabbeinu, addressing his last testament to the Jewish community, perhaps on his last day, said, Ki ha-mitzvah hazeh asher onechi mitzavcho hayim le'niflei simimroch v'lei recheiko hi le'bashomayim hi le'mer miyalonu hashomayim aviyikechenu lanu כי קורא ולך הדובר מי בפיחו בלבחו לעשי. Why did he say that? What was the reason for this statement? The reason because he could not impose the Torah upon the Jewish community without giving them the full assurance that this Torah is a Torah's Chaim and can be realized in every situation, under all circumstances, at all times, in all places. So basically teaching is first, as a teacher I know, when I enter a class, first of all I think of the idea, can I teach something to this group of boys? Are they teachable, so to say? Or will they respond to my effort? Will I be able to open communication lines with them? Will I stimulate their minds? Will I intrigue them with halachic problems in a very mechanical age, utilitarian age? Or will they prosper spiritually under my guidance? Or will they realize the beauty and the grandeur of Torah Shebal Peh? This is my first problem. And this problem I resolve easily, I believe, that it is possible, it's quite probable that I'll be successful in my efforts. Not because I am an exceptional teacher, because I believe that every Jew is capable of comprehending the Torah. However, let us just ask about the ideal. What is my ideal as a teacher? What am I striving for? What is my lishmo? It is teleological action. And I must say, let me just, I don't want to brag, but I don't teach just incidentally. I'm usually well prepared, and I work hard on my shurim, and I enjoy teaching. You know, I don't punch the clock in the classroom. I know the time when I walk into the classroom. It's usually 20 minutes past 9, a quarter to 10. I can never tell you when I'll walk out from the classroom. It is sometimes 1 o'clock, sometimes 2, and sometimes 3. I mean, it depends upon the union and upon my involvement and the involvement on the part of my pupils in the union. But I certainly am guided by an ideal. What is my ideal? Why should I speak in personal terms? What should be the ideal of every teacher in Israel? Of every teacher, every rabbi is a teacher. It's basically the most outstanding connotation of the term Rav, teacher. What should be the ideal? All right, it is teleological action, it's purposive action, it's action directed toward a certain great objective. What is this objective? Do you clarify this objective? Do you try to define this objective? You know very well, if I don't know for whose sake I am writing the get, so the get is void and null. You cannot determine an objective in general terms, in equivocal terms. You must simply spell it out and define it precisely. Of course, many people in this hall and certainly many of my colleagues at the yeshiva and other yeshivas will say this is a rhetorical question. Well, you know what the purpose and the objective of a teacher is. We know of a Rosh Yeshiva, we're not speaking about a teacher of math, but of a Rosh Yeshiva. We all know it's simple, it's elementary. What is it? No, Rabbi? Yeah, it's very simple. Yeah, very simple. Yeah, what does Abbatzester mean? Abbatzester means teaching. It's just a pictorial phrase which has the equivalence of teaching. in terms of semantics. Of course, they'll say everybody knows what the task of Rosh Yeshiva is, to teach Torah, to explain some prima facie incoherent words in Rishonim, to elucidate obscure passages in the Gemara, to reconcile contradictory halachas in the Rambam. I know these. To ask questions or kashas, and to resolve problems raised by others, and certainly to impart factual information to the pupil to make him accumulate knowledge as much as possible. That's what you call our Botzester. Matter of fact, from time to time I engage in this type of work. Of course, all these elements are included in the practical program of a teacher, no doubt about it. However, they are of a secondary nature. The first and foremost duty of the teacher is to instill in the student. No, you wouldn't guess, no. Because it's so simple that you can't guess. A sense of lumdus. Lumdus, you know what lumdus is? Right. Now, what is lumdus? It certainly cannot be equated with erudition. No. Even though the latter is indispensable for the acquisition of lumdus. Certainly, one cannot be considered a lamdan if he is not an erudite person, if he doesn't have vast knowledge, halachic knowledge. However, erudition alone does not make a person a lamdan. The old maxim of the medieval logic that while non-compliance with a formal principle renders all propositions void, there is no warranty for truth in the compliance with a formal principle. The old maxim that the absence makes a certain proposition worthless, renders a certain proposition void and null, yet the presence of a certain element is no warranty for the truthfulness of this proposition. This maxim, it's an old Aristotelian maxim, is applicable to erudition or pkias. Without erudition, lumdus is unattainable. But one can be a very erudite person and still not be a lam. I don't want to mention names anyway. You know what we used in Lithuania used to say? God knows how to interpret it. He knows the daf. In order to understand what lumdus represents, we must cope with another problem. And it's a very important problem. What is halacha? What is the essence of halacha? Or what is the essence of Torah Shebal Peh? Because a lam means an expert in the field of halacha. If we understand or simply be able to define the essence, the very substance of halacha, we will also find the proper definition concerning the lam. Yeah, halacha nowadays is a very popular term. Even conservative rabbis speak of halacha. However, if you know how to define this term, again, I must contradict the popular notion. Which has become almost an integral part of our vernacular, rabbinic vernacular. The halacha, if you should ask someone what the halacha stands for, he will give you immediately an answer. The halacha is a code of law. The halacha, a more modern person, with a college degree, will say halacha is religious jurisprudence. A Christian theologian will say, if inquired, if this inquiry should be addressed to him, he'll answer, halacha is rabbinic or Pharisaic legalism. Other people, plain Jews, who stand closer to Yehadus and have a more intimate relationship with Yehadus, who when confronted by such an inquiry, who will answer the halacha is a collection of positive and negative commandments, mitzvahs aseh, mitzvahs leis aseh, restrictions, prohibitions, and duties. In a word, halacha is the Shulchan Aruch. Now let us see. Are all these definitions correct or incorrect? Of course, the definition rabbinic legalism is completely wrong, because it means not only a collection of laws, but it means a philosophy that the religious experience exhausts itself in legalistic terms. However, the equation of halacha with religious norm, we call it commandment, is only partly true. It is partly true. Again, the old medieval maxim that certain criteria are indispensable for the logical proposition, yet their presence does not mean that this proposition is true, is applicable to the definition that halacha is a collection of mitzvahs. Certainly. Halacha without mitzvahs is unimaginable. It is sheer absurdity to imagine a halachic system devoid of mitzvahs maasiyos or the halachic norm. There is no doubt that the normative element is fundamental in halacha. However, the halacha as a discipline or as a system transcends the bounds of the religious norm. It's more than a Shulchan Aruch. Unless the term Shulchan Aruch will also be projected on a different, so to say, against a different background. And let me take an example as an illustration. In order to illustrate this point, let me just introduce an example from the field of sciences. If, for instance, a mathematician who were asked, I believe you teach math, don't you? So I'll ask you. I'm not a mathematician, but if a mathematician were asked the same question, what is math? Or a physicist should be approached with the inquiry, what does mathematical physics stand for? He would never say, never, if he's a good mathematician, and if he's an intelligent physicist. I know many who are stupid. He would never say that math or physics is identical with a collection of equations or natural laws. No physicist or a mathematician of note who would point out a good, recently published handbook of math, of physics, a comprehensive math book, and state in all naivete, this is the discipline of math and physics, or that math and physics is identical with a certain book, to be the most ridiculous definition. Nothing would be more remote from the truth than such a misleading identification or definition of science. What is math or physics? I'm neither a mathematician nor a physicist. If I'm wrong, correct me. If in the hall there are a few physicists or mathematicians. If I'm wrong, if I'm right, so at least confirm my statement. Math and physics constitute nothing else. And when I say math and physics, I mean natural sciences as a whole. Of course, precise science, exact sciences, mathematical sciences, constitute a way of thinking, not equations. They don't exhaust itself or themselves in equations, in laws. Laws and equations are products of a certain way of thinking. But basically, science is a method, a singular way of thinking, using the old medieval term. It is a modus cogitandi, a unique manner in which the creative mind, the creative human genius mind, postulates, brings forth an a priori frame of reference, creates a deductive system within which an empirical world view is evolved. The equations, the laws, the rules, the directives of science are the products, the results of this unique, singular thinking, of the creative, cognitive gesture which purges reality of its crude qualitative substance and supplants this substance with thoughts constructs. What do you say, right or wrong?
Right, have a name.
All right, okay. Fine, good. Science basically is not a factum, but an actus, method, way of thinking. It's a gesture, a performance. Science is creative thinking, which has its starting point, or what the neo-Kantians call its Ursprung, its origin, not outside, but within itself. The same, my friends, Rabbi said, is true of halacha. The latter transcends the bounds of the religious norm, even though the religious norm is indispensable within the halachic system. This element of duty, of obligation, this element of normative pressure and compliance with the norm is irreplaceable. But, as I said before, halacha as a system transcends the bounds of the religious norm. It is mainly a great method, both of cognition and of relating oneself to God and to the world. The halacha is not confined to mere norms. It is rather a creative cognitive gesture out of which an order of free constructs emerges with which the norm is associated. The halacha creates its own world and fixes a unique normative relationship to it. The norm is originally unrelated to concrete events and situations. Its background is a pure cognitive one. If there is, for instance, a commandment of Sukkah, the halacha places it first within the framework of ideal constructs. And the Sukkah, when studied in the classroom, I cannot say anything about Shurim and Sukkah delivered by other yeshivas, but I know about myself. When studied under my guidance in the classroom, so the Sukkah does not consist of boards and branches. As electricity in physics does not consist of this bright light by which we read and play and work, but of a mathematical equation. So does the Sukkah, as an abstract construct consist of mechitzes, which is nothing but an abstract idea, and schach. But the schach in the Gemara is not the green schach, the beautiful, fresh, green, tender schach with which we cover the Sukkah, whose relationship to the actual Sukkah is similar to the relationship which prevailed between the electric bulb and the mathematical equation governing this quantitative phenomenon. In view of this, we must conceive revelation, divine revelation, under the aspect not only of transcendental normativism or imperativism, the fact that God has revealed his will, and his will was imposed upon the covenantal community, but also under the aspect of transcendental intellectualism, the fact that God has revealed not only mitzvahs, but a method as well, a logic, a singular approach to reality. The divine logic or method was not foisted upon the community. For a method, unlike a norm, does not lend itself to obedient acceptance, but to free comprehension and assimilation into one's mind. At the level of transcendental imperativism, God appeared to the members of the community as a king and commanded them to accept kofaleim harkegigis. On the second level, he appeared as a teacher who instructed them. God is melamed olam Yisrael. Man's response to the great halachic challenge asserts itself not only in blind acceptance of the divine imperative, but also in assimilating a transcendental method or methodology which was entrusted to us. Therefore, it's absurd to say that the halachic research consists of the study of texts. It has become very popular of late. Even when one wants to write a thesis for a DHL. Instead, it is a creative performance. We reject shinui in the halacha, certainly. No shinui in the halacha, no changes. Yet chidush, creativity, is the very essence of the halachic gesture. If we turn now to consider what lomdes is, we will understand at once that the latter consists in the acquisition and proper application of the singular halachic method. The lam must be able to think precisely in halachic categories, to define and classify data within halachic frame of reference, to be able to abstract from transient events and relate situations to an eternal halachic principle. All our positions as regards tangible occurrences, focal and marginal, must be transferred to an abstract halachic level. And I want you to know there is no need in the halacha to resolve kashes, to give terutzim and kashes. Whoever is a contractor or has a signed agreement with his talmidim that he must answer all questions and resolve all problems, is not a Rosh Yeshiva, is not a Lamdan, or to defend the Rambam. I try to defend, but if I can't defend the Rambam, I admit that I don't understand. Our task is to think clearly, in conformity with halachic logic and epistemology, to be able to define precisely and subsume under higher units lower concepts, even though at times we encounter insoluble problems and our thinking ends into Yufte. The children of Rabbi Kweger, when they published posthumously his work, wrote of him, "Lehoya mitztayer ala kusho, lehoya semeach ala tirutz." He never was saddened by a kasha he could not resolve, and he never rejoiced in a teretz. It's not our job to resolve problems or to reach decisions. Our job is to understand. There are insoluble equations in matter. The job of the mathematician is to understand why they are insoluble. The same method should be employed by the man of halacha, by the Lamb. Two things should be noted, and this is very important for rabbis. Lomdes is not only indispensable for Rosh Yeshiva, whose job it is to deliver shurim, or to elucidate halachic problems, or to explore halachic aspects, but for a practicing rabbi as well. For a roye today, call it practical rabbinics, I don't know the equivalent in English for a roye today requires perhaps the highest degree of clear, precise, and creative thinking. The type of shilas with which the rabbi comes face to face at present are both staggering in their magnitude and paradoxical as to the coincidence of the most unlikely events and situations, and touch upon the very foundations of halachic life and halachic destiny. They cover the whole gamut of halachic thinking. They simply, and I'm speaking from experience, defy the imagination of the most trained halachic scholar. And I want to tell you, in most cases there are no handbooks or achrenim which I could consult in order to find a ready-made psak. Lomdes of the highest caliber is necessary for a roye in our day and age. To decide just on the basis, even in Chesaveles, to decide just on the basis of Hoch Letzorah, which is the most chaotic, incoherent collection I have ever seen in my life. Or Kolbe it's called now. Or other populars for him is sheer irresponsibility on the part of the rabbi. Take for instance inquiries pertaining to the use, and I'm not delivering your decisions, rendering decisions here, excuse me, but I'm just giving you an example. Take for instance inquiries pertaining to the use of modern electrical gadgets on the Shabbos, on the Sabbath. You simply cannot make arbitrary statements with regard to this. You cannot just say this is Asr Mutar because I want it to be either Asr or Mutar. and give preference at random to Machmirim or to Mekilim. We must investigate first the scientific aspects in order to approach the gadget intelligently, of course. But second, we cannot fall back to old, let's say, to Achrenim or to old texts, since the whole problem is new. Basic halachic research is unavoidable, and an inquiry in the very halachic foundations is essential. By quoting Achrenim and substituting terms, names for concepts, as many do, we will not resolve such staggering problems pertaining to the Shabbos. As a matter of fact, I want to give you just a hint. If basic research is to be done on the problems of the electrical gadgets on Shabbos, the use of electrical gadgets on Shabbos, the use of hot water on Shabbos, it should revolve around one problem, namely, what is the role of Keach Achar Meurev B'Shabbos? The act of initiating mechanical or electrical action which will automatically perform the work. Is the one who initiated the action, launched the action, or sponsored the force responsible for the consummation of the performance or not? This is in our halachic terms. You wouldn't find this phrase in any sefer. It's my vocabulary. In my vocabulary, it's the problem of Keach Achar Meurev Bei Shabbos. We know of Keach Achar Meurev Bei in relation to Eish. What's about Shabbos? This problem was raised indirectly by the Rambam, and the Ramban in the controversy regarding the Af Meloche of Charishe, tilling the ground, and a thorough analysis, conceptual analysis, creative conceptual analysis is indispensable if we are going to resolve this problem. It depends upon the time element, it depends upon many factors. By writing tshuvas and publishing tshuvas, and introducing symbols and terms which don't represent concepts, and by trying to resolve this problem in metaphors and in primitive pictorial language, we wouldn't attain it. The same is true, the same approach must be employed to questions in other sectors of modern life with which the halacha is concerned, and please tell me with which sector is the halacha not concerned. Second, and this is perhaps the most important aspect, and the most important relevant issue of today. The historical method applied to halacha has nothing in common with Lamdes. I am not speaking about this method from the viewpoint of both faith in the principle of Torah min hashamayim and absolute imperativism with which we approach the mitzvahs. I'm speaking from an epistemological viewpoint. But let me just for a while depart from the text and say that the historical method, and you know what I am referring to, if not qualified, and recklessly applied to the study of Torah Shebal Peh, must lead to the denial of the principle of Torah Min HaShamayim, willy-nilly, and dispel the aura of Kedusha, which has surrounded the Torah Shebal Peh throughout the ages. It will also, the historical method, if applied unreservedly, recklessly, will also completely undermine the normative authority of halacha. Its imperatives, its mitzvahs, will no longer be considered unconditionally binding. Men, selfish and pleasure-seeking and petty, will invent many mitigating circumstances which will excuse him from strict compliance with the norm. If Torah Shebal Peh is placed exclusively in a historical perspective, if the latter, the religious norm, is a product of bygone times and of historical forces and circumstances, then the mere fact that we live in a different age lessens, indeed suspends our commitment. I believe that there is no need for demonstrating this thesis. Religious realities in our country confirm it. However, what is more important now is not what is important now is not the dogmatic but the cognitive aspect. As it was stated previously, Lamdes consists in systematic conceptual approach to halacha. For as we have emphasized, halacha itself is a method, a logic, a mode of cognition which has evolved its own categories, terms, cognitive rules and criteria. By saying, for instance, that the halacha of Gudasik Mechitzte, and I'm quoting someone, a scholar, of course in quotation marks, a scholar, that the halacha of Gudasik Mechitzte is due, you know what Gudasik Mechitzte is? Means the Mechitzte is continuous. If I put up a Mechitzte of 10 Tforim, I visualize the Mechitzte as if it reached the limit for the Mechitzte is the sky, as if it reached the heavens. Gudasik Mechitzte. The Mechitzte continues upward. That the halacha of Gudasik Mechitzte is due to the fact there was a scarcity of wood in Eretz Yisrael. All right? I don't know. I'm not a historian. I do not know whether there was a scarcity of wood in Eretz Yisrael, or Eretz Yisrael had plentiful of wood. But I know one thing, that by saying this, one does not explain what Gudasik Mechitzte stands for. The conceptual content of the halacha is completely unexplained. There is, of course, there is certainly a history and a sociology of mathematics, certainly. Some social psychologists and sociologists may try to explain in their lingo why did Euclid postulate his geometric system? What prompted him to assume that there are two parallel lines, or that the shortest distance between 2 points is the straight line? But perhaps there is a psychological explanation, I don't know. Or even some psychoanalyst may find some complex in Euclid which is responsible for the Euclidean geometry. It's quite possible. Or someone may ask what psychological factors motivated Newton or Leibniz to invent the calculus. As a matter of fact, there is such a discipline under the name sociology of science, which was very popular in Austria, in the pre-war Austria. I don't know, I haven't heard much of it in America. Sociology of science and culture, which is preoccupied with problems of this kind. However, this type of scientific investigation cannot be subsumed under mathematics. It has bearing only upon the psychological portrayal of the mathematician as an individual, as a living person, acting under the impact of psycho-spiritual forces. It has, however, no significance whatsoever as far as the study of space is concerned, or the study of math is concerned. For the latter can only be understood and comprehended in specific categories within its own frame of reference. A sociologist or a psychologist interested in sciences as a socio-cultural phenomenon are not natural scientists or mathematicians. Vice versa, the mathematician or physicist is not concerned with socio-cultural problems. And I want you to know one thing. I know what many of you think. This does not mean that the halacha is not time conscious. Does not mean. We are not fossils, as our opponents try to say, or that it is completely irresponsive to human need, because human need basically is historical need. And it is completely unaware of historical challenges. Whoever knows just a little about the halachic temper knows how sensitive it is to human affliction on the one hand and historical realities on the other. It's very sensitive. The halacha has never staggered, never became stupefied. On the one hand and historical realities on the other. It's very sensitive. The halacha has never staggered, never became stupefied and impotent under the onslaught of gigantic historical forces. It was always able to follow and grasp the significance of events and the relevance of historical occurrences in halachic terms. However, the halachic response to historical occurrences can only be formulated in its unique way. It must emerge from the inner recesses of halachic thinking. We cannot, must not think in sociological historical categories. And I'll give you an example again. Science keeps pace with need, with human need, certainly, and historical demands. When the war broke out, and it was mandatory to develop self-regulating anti-aircraft guns, the scientists plunged into, until then, an unknown field of automation or mechanical computation, etc. When our country has encountered the awesome possibility of Germany mastering first atomic energy, it mobilized the best available intellectual manpower and left the enemy lagging far behind. However, the mathematicians and physicists involved in all these projects, who worked not with historical categories, but with singular scientific methods, and did not try to solve a mathematical problem within a historical frame of reference. The same is true of the halacha. The historical need arouses the creative human genius. It stimulates his superior spiritual powers. It fills him with determination and exalts his unique logical perceptibility and enhances his creative faculties. However, the thinking, postulating, concluding and deciding can only be executed in conformity with halachic methodology. All right, there was a problem for Agunes. You cannot just give a wholesale heter for Agunes. Of course, the tendency on our part was always Nikure with regard to Agunes. You know very well the maxim if Shumei Gune Kule Rabbana. But these kules cannot be just arbitrarily be applied in sociological terms. Say, since there was a war, it's impossible to find evidence, so let us do away with certain halachic rules and say that all those whose husbands disappeared, should be permitted to remarry. This cannot be done. The scientists who worked on the computer could not say that, because the war demands an immediate answer to their problem. So let the machine, compute, let the computer come into existence. We cannot do that. If we are under stress, we think harder. We immobilize our intellectual faculties, and need arouses us, stimulates, inspires us. And the human genius may apprehend, behold, a certain vision which he could not see before. But the response to the need, even the most potent response to the need, can only be in halachic terms. Creative, inventive, ingenious, but precisely halachic. And Rabbi said, here and only here lies our strength. And I have elaborated this aspect because I want every one of you, to understand that in this field lies our strength vis-a-vis our ideological opponents. Only those rabbis who studied in the various yeshivas, I don't claim monopoly, all yeshivas are good as far as I am concerned. All of the rabbis who studied in various yeshivas had the opportunity to receive the proper training in Torah Shebal Peh. We all were privileged, without exception, to enter the world of halachic ideas, to learn how to conceptualize halachic data, how to analyze halachic texts, how to think in halachic categories, and to be halachically creative. I do not know whether or not many among us, appreciate this singular gift which was bestowed upon us by the Ashgochim. Because a father or a mother was dedicated to our tradition and sent his or her boy to yeshiva. Of course, not all of us have an equal share in this great spiritual adventure, which I call Torah Shebal Peh, or halachic thinking. Some know more, some know less. However, we are all committed and related to Torah Shebal Peh. And we enjoy, all of us, its grandeur and glory. And if the Perek, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos said, Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek leilam habo, I would paraphrase the saying, Kol bnei yeshiva יש להם חלק בתורה שבעל פה. And I do not want, and it isn't my intention tonight, it's too late and I'm tired. And in general, lately I don't want to engage in arguments, in debates, in symposia with our ideological opponents. I have arrived at the conclusion that less we'll talk about them, the better off we'll be. Because talking about our opponents reflects a feeling of insecurity. The person who is secure and proud in what he is does not talk about his opponents. He talks about himself. I wouldn't say about his accomplishments, but as I said before, about his ideals and what he's supposed to accomplish. But however, since we were asked lately by the leadership of a certain group a very clear, a very elementary question, we will have to answer this question. And I'll do it tonight. We were asked, what is the difference between us and them? Either we all are nonconformists or all consecrated and dedicated to Jewish tradition and Maseret. This question was asked publicly at a certain conference. Let me answer this question clearly. I believe there are three basic differences between the Rabbinical Council of America. I'm including the Igud Rabbanim and the Agudas Rabbanim as well. Between the Orthodox Rabbinate, or let's call about the Status Rabbanim, and the other group. First, we are all ma'aminim in Torah min hashamayim. I wouldn't spell out the negative, I'll spell out the positive side. To us, the Torah is divine, not human. We follow its directives, not for ethical, cultural, historical, but transcendental reasons. We conceive our Torah Shebal Peh in terms not of historical relativism as a purely human tradition, but in categories of absolute normativism as an ultimate divine Masera. Our opponents, and perhaps rightly so, may lay claim to modernism. I'm not denying it. And dynamism. Perhaps they're right. I am not in a mood to refute any of these claims. I'm just stating a fact. We are maminim, and a mamin must insist upon ultimates in the stream of relativity, upon fixity in the flux of becoming and emergence. And we insist upon normative fixity and imperatives as ultimates. No human hand can change, modify, or qualify these imperatives. And again, I don't condemn. To paraphrase Spinoza, my task is not to argue, nor to condemn, nor to bemoan, nor to glorify, but just to state the facts. We belong to the community of Maminim in Torah min hashamayim. Whether Torah min hashamayim is compatible with modern sociology and psychology, and modern history of religion, and biblical criticism and archaeology, as lately we heard that in one people say the Torah Shebal Peh is not reconcilable with the with modern research and scholarship, I don't know, and I'm not engaging anybody in argument or a symposium. We are meaning, in spite of biblical criticism and archaeology and psychology and sociology and logic, we belong to a community of Maminim in Torah min Hashamayim, and in the ultimate normative character of our mitzvah. And that the Masera is not human but divine. It is transcendental and hence eternal. This is the first difference. If they are insisting upon a dialogue, let us have it. And let me say here, publicly, of course parenthetically, I'm not, that it isn't an integral part of this paper. No one who casts any doubt upon the divine nature of our faith or of our Torah Shebeksav or Shebal Peh. No one who subjects the principle of Torah min Hashamayim to critical revision, even if he does it with charity and love and dedication and warmth and zeal, has a right to call himself an Orthodox Jew. He's certainly wrong if he classifies himself as an Orthodox rabbi, whether he's in New York or in London. Again, imitating Spinoza, I do not castigate or condemn anybody. Our modern society enjoys freedom of thought and opinion, and I am not tempted by the whispering of the Satan to curb these basic civil rights. Otherwise, they'll send another cablegram to Eshkol. What I am saying is plain and simple, that a person of such a persuasion, however sincere, honest, in my opinion very foolish, such a person, however sincere and honest, has voluntarily placed himself outside of the Masorah fellowship and cannot be counted any longer as a brother in unqualified faith handed down to us by our sacred martyrs, scholars and teachers, and cannot be considered as a fellow student of the traditional Beis HaMidrash. What is amusing in this whole situation is the fact that such an attitude on the part of one who expounds views contrary to the very substance of our Maseret still wants to parade as an Orthodox rabbi is reminiscent of some American hate-mongering groups which ostentatiously keep on speaking in the name of freedom and our Constitution. Again, I am not defending now the system of political democracy. Perhaps a corporate tyrannical state is to be preferred. A warped mind may think in such terms. What I am curious about is the audacity displayed by these groups in insisting that they defend the Constitution against the alleged onslaught or encroachment upon civil liberties by the White House and the Supreme Court. The problem is that these people in the political field and the people with an eye Torah min Hashamayim in the religious field and still want to be considered as rabbis, full-fledged rabbis, as teachers, as meirei derech, complying with Masereh, violate or contravene the old maxim of contradiction formulated by Aristotle, that a logical proposition may not contain two mutually exclusive terms. And the term orthodox and the term Teiro Eino Min HaShamayim are mutually exclusive. Second, there is a second difference. We all are Shemrei Mitzvah. I hope that I am correct in stating that. When I say we, I mean members of the RCA, perhaps the Gudei Rabbanim. We observe the Sabbath meticulously, and we do kedinu kedas. We do not discriminate between major and minor aspects in halacha. As far as we are concerned, there are no peripheral mitzvahs at all. All mitzvahs are central, focal. There is almost no difference. Why almost? There is no difference as far as we are concerned between keeping the place of business open and carrying a newspaper or handkerchief on the Shabbos. Between cooking fowl, a bird in milk, and drinking stam yenam. There's no difference. Between driving a car to shul or to a nightclub on the Shabbos. Some of us, and I say it in humility, may perhaps from time to time transgress certain rules, contravene certain rules of Kedushas Beis HaKnesses. And heavens know that in 99 cases they do it under duress, under coercive circumstances. My position on this issue, I articulate it quite often. I don't have now to expound it. However, these non-conforming rabbis, as far as Kedushas Beis HaKnesses is concerned, are, as much as I know, to the best of my knowledge, in their personal lives, perfect Shemrei Mitzvah, without compromising on any halachic issue. Shabbos, kashrus, tefillin, tzitzis. We can find their children in yeshivas, in kelim, devoting their time to the study of Torah Shebaal Peh. As a matter of fact, we all have been blessed by the Ashgoch with children who surpass us in kanoes and in piety. I don't know whether they surpass us in lomdes, but certainly in kanoes and piety. This is the second difference. There is a third difference, and perhaps the most important one. And this difference expresses itself in our relationship to Torah Shebaal Peh, to halacha. We are boneo shel Torah. Matter of fact, I told it to one Israeli official who asked me about the difference between the Rabbinic Council of America and another rabbinic group. We are boneo shel Torah, the children of Torah Shebaal Peh, steeped in Torah thinking, in Torah intuiting. We study the Torah, not in sociological or historical categories, not in terms of textual criticism, even though we avail ourselves of this method when necessary. We do not know of the influence of the Roman law, on our civil law. I don't know. I don't know Roman law. I don't know the influence which the Roman law has exerted upon civil law, and I believe there was no influence that was exerted. Nor do we take cognizance of the Hellenistic motives in our world view. We are illiterate in this sense. We are uncultured, we are unsophisticated. Yes. However, we take pride in the fact that we know what Yuchlat Asher is. Machlekes of between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael, Yuchlat Asher or Yusam Asher. We know what Rabbi Akiva means, what Rabbi Ishmael wants to convey to us. We know what Shibud Derais is. We know what Edi Mesire Karse. We know what Mitzvah Sreres Kavone. And we know what Mitzvah Abo Baver is. We are creative in the realm of authentic, distinct halachic thought, and we are committed to it. However inadequate our intellectual halachic involvement may be, it is and will remain a halachic gesture. That is to say, an act of participation in the great Maseret commenced by Moses and extending into eternity until Achris Hayomim. We are members of a great community, initiated perhaps by Moshe Rabbeinu, perhaps by Abraham, which includes the Melech HaMoshiach among its members. The distance between our opponents and Torah Shebaal Peh is immense. It is, if one may say, and use a theological term, and the American Jewish Committee has introduced now theological terms into the vernacular. If I may say, use a theological term, it is a distantia maxima. Now let's get back to our problem. In light of this analysis, my friends, I cannot help but say, and perhaps to the dismay and say dislike of the great preachers we have in our midst now, and I'm also sort of a maggid, that the epoch of preaching and sermonizing has passed. I doubt whether it will ever come back. The epoch of preaching, of the droshe as a potent factor in capturing the minds of the people, is passé, gentlemen. Willy-nilly, you'll have to agree with me. You know, I have changed my style. I stopped saying droshes. Really. The heyday of homiletics, or of Haggadah interpreted, not in halachic terms, but in homiletical terms, is gone. The halacha conceptualism, halachic conceptualism, has supplanted Haggadic metaphorism and emotionalism. The position of the young Jew of today, of the religious Jew I'm speaking, and also of the Jew whom we want to reclaim from agnosticism and primitive religiosity. The position of the young Jew of today, marked out in advance by the secular training he receives, is an intellectual one. He will never, even for a single moment, retreat from this intellectual position. Let us not forget that most young men with a yeshiva background, and I happen to be in touch with these young men, study math and physics and sciences, where the art of abstraction and precise thinking reigns supreme. They think in concepts, not in pictures, in abstract cognitive forms, and not in lens-shaped, notched metaphors. The halachic discourse suits the academically trained mind more than a devotional, inspiring sermon. I personally have had enormous success with popular halachic lectures. Of engaging in a shallow, sentimental exposition about prayer and describe its essence exclusively in terms of mental health and mental hygiene. And I don't say that it is not true. It is a certain aspect from which we may approach prayer or other mitzvahs, because the redemptive faculty and the remedial energy which a mitzvah contains is enormous. However, instead of relying exclusively upon this therapeutic aspect implied in mitzvahs, we should try to clarify and expound to the layman sound halachic foundations of prayer in a language, of course, comprehensible to the average educated layman. When I say a language comprehensible, I don't mean English. I mean vis-a-vis another language. I mean at a conceptual level. We should divest Londres of its specific jargon. Every discipline has a jargon. If you popularize a discipline, what do? You don't falsify concepts. You don't distort ideas. You simply translate concepts into concepts. Or you translate jargon terms into terms of the vernacular. For instance, or you could explain to the layman at a halachic level that tefillah means amido mifnei Hashem, confrontation with God. We could explain what halachically being confronted by God means. We don't have we wouldn't have to employ categories involved by Kierkegaard or Otto or Sabatier or Schleiermacher. There would be no need. Halacha has its own tools, its own categorical apparatus. We have to explain the element of kavanah in tefillah. We could explain the structural patterns of Shemoneh Esrei, Shevach, Bakoshe, Eidoeh. We could also expound the concept of Avodah Shebelev, and so forth and so on. The same is true of Shabbos. Rather than indulging in a descriptive cliches about the serenity and peace, the sense of peace one experiences on the day of Sabbath, I would describe in conceptual terms the halachic principles governing the prohibition against engaging in work on Shabbos. What does the term melacha mean? For instance, when the physicist speaks of work, it's a mathematical equation. When the economist speaks of work, of labor, it is worth producing performance. What is the concept of Melacha and Shabbos? Is it to be equated with the concept of work in physics, with a mathematical equation, or with the concept of work or labor in economics? Or perhaps it's a new concept, it's a new category, evolved and developed by halacha. Or, for instance, the concept of meleches machshavos, intentional performance, intentional act, which plays such an important role in modern philosophy, in Brentano, and we have an expert on Brentano here, Rabbi Würzburger. I'm afraid to speak about Brentano in his presence. And in Husserl and Heidegger, it led up to existentialism, this concept of the intentional performance. Shabbos, meleches machshavos means intentional performance. To analyze this intentional performance, the elements of definition, This would commend the respect of the layman, of the educated layman, because in 10 years from now, and 5 years from now, we will deal with the college-trained congregations. Let's not fool ourselves. We are not dealing anymore with the primitive immigrants, but with people with trained minds, and some are outstanding in their field. We have to commend their respect. The respect can be commended only by popularizing the halacha and simply explain to them or introducing them into the great world of halachic thinking. And I can tell you, and I'm not in a mood of apology. It's not apologetics I'm engaging in talk, because I hate apologetics. It reflects only a restless mind, insecurity on the part of the person. But in all honesty, I can tell you, I know more or less philosophy. I'm at home in many philosophical sectors, particularly in logic and epistemology. This is my field. My field is not philosophy of religion. I've never taken even a single course in philosophy of religion. I just became a philosopher of religion somehow. I don't know, in Boston somehow, under the shadow of Rabbi. But that our lucky we have developed, and of course, my grandfather, and this is not said in the sense of nepotism or somehow pride in my ancestry, my grandfather has contributed greatly to this advance. The methods, the cognitive methods, and the logical categories, and the art of abstraction, and the precise thinking that halacha employs is not inferior to the methods and categories and thinking in modern advanced math or philosophy, logic, or epistemology. We can compete with anybody. Let us impart genuine Torah knowledge to the laity. And I am not asking, I want you to understand me, as a result of this suggestion to wipe clean the slate of the colorful religious experience and cast in the lot of the American religious Jew who is exclusively halachic formalism and conceptualism. I am not asking you just to acknowledge that the halachic gesture is the only one in Yahadus. Of course, there is an Agada. Yahadus, I always say, is both a great discipline, a great method of thinking, but also a great adventure, a great romance between God and man. Not only can Yahadus be approached by the mind, but by the heart as well. As a matter of fact, you cannot divorce the heart from the mind. Even while one engages in strict halachic thinking, he must sometimes listen carefully to the whispering of the heart. All I want you to say, to know, is the halachic gesture has captured the center of our religious awareness, and that no matter how important, inspiring, and redeeming the subjective experience is, it cannot strike roots in an intellectual vacuum. The experiential element is Yahadus, is interwoven in the halachic thought fabric. Of course, our opponents, they have separated Yahadus from the halachic component part and converted it into an emotional performance, into sentimentalism, neo-Hasidism, emotionalism, existentialism. Basically, the halacha has been divested of its very substance, has forfeited its very essence, and became a vacuum, intellectual vacuum. And let us not forget that the great debate between us and other groups will be resolved in the next 10 years, 10, 15 years, perhaps 20 years. Whether I'll be here to see it, I don't know. At an intellectual level. Neither Charomes, nor Isurim, nor calling of names, or preaching about our wonderful, about preaching in a temper of self-righteousness, that we are wonderful and the other groups are inadequate and bad, will resolve the debate. On the contrary, it will aggravate conditions. The debate will be resolved at the level of intellectualism. And it is obvious that we have an edge over them. For our Yehadus abounds in boundless noetic wealth, in enormous spiritual treasures. No phraseology of existentialism, no essays and books about the historic forces which shaped Judaism, who will dare to engage the precise creative halacha in a contest. And if it will engage, dare to do so, I am certain we shall emerge triumphant. For halachic thought and methodology can compete with the most advanced method of thinking in modern science, epistemology, and logic. This is one idea. Now, if you permit me just short time, I want to convey to you another idea which always inspires me when I teach my students. This idea has been beckoning to the great teachers in Israel and is worth pursuing. The idea, the second ideal which I pursue is that by teaching I should succeed in fashioning and molding a halachic personality. It's not only a question of knowledge, or of a trained mind, or of a skill and art of thinking, but I want to fashion and mold the personality of my Talmidim. And if halacha is not just a conglomeration of rules, restrictions, and prohibitions, but a system, a unity, a thought entity, fashioned by divine gesture, by singular logic and epistemology, then the halacha is real. Real, I underline this. Then the halacha is not just an abstract idea, knowledge which is not nurtured by the substance of our spiritual personality, but a part of ourselves, an inner spiritual power within man. Halacha should change to a marked extent the manner in which the one who is committed to halacha perceives things and events, the way in which he fashions his ideas, builds his world formula from sense impressions, and expresses his message to others through word and action. We intend to fashion a personality who should apprehend the world through a peculiar halachic temper. What does it mean, an halachic temper? A peculiar halachic mood. There is, for instance, a peculiar scientific temper. A scientist is not only an expert in his field, there is a scientific personality. His approach to phenomena is different than our approach. His perceptibility is unique. He somehow is susceptible to certain phenomena which don't intrigue us at all. And he responds to certain events in a manner which is very singular. And so is the man of halacha, as I call him in Hebrew the Ish halacha. What does a halachic personality mean? What is the singular halachic temper? And I believe the answer is simple. The halachic personality is a moral personality. Because there is formal halacha, which expresses itself in the halachic substance which has been discussed and debated, analyzed and expounded throughout the ages by our great scholars. And there is also halachic morality. Of course, many people ask, what is halachic morality? What must a person do in order to attain this morality? I don't know what he must do. I know what he mustn't do. In order not to be hindered from attaining this morality. Let me just for a short while, state the case of halachic morality. Many people may say there is no halachic morality. There is halachic formalism. There's halachic formalism. You should give tzedakah, you should be generous, you should do good to your fellow man, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't rob, you shouldn't murder, you shouldn't desecrate the Sabbath, you should lay tefillin, you should pray thrice daily, but there is no halachic morality. It's halachic formalism, technical formalism. Is there halachic morality or isn't there halachic morality? Above and beyond halachic formalism. What do you say about it? After all, as rabbis, you should know about it. What is it? It's Dr. Mishpa, I don't know what you understand by tzedakah. Of course, you know very well the expression lifnim mishuras hadin points toward halachic morality. But we all know the famous passage in the Ramban at the beginning of the Parsha Gdeshim, in Gdeshim Tir Elekechem, that the Rabban has coined a very unusual, peculiar phrase, which has been utilized and employed time and again by the Balei Musa, by the Jewish moralists, particularly of the last generation. And the Ramban said, Yesh le'lo odom le'nabe l'atzmei b'rshus haTorah. A man may lead a dishonorable life while not violating a single law in the code. What did the Ramban mean to say? Isn't he violating a single law in the code? So if it's not in violation of a single law in the code, why is it dishonorable? Why is it dishonorable? Why does he call him novel? Why is it ignominious? And the Ramban gives examples. The Ramban introduces illustrations. For instance, he says there is no specific injunction in the Torah against gluttony as such, overindulgence in food, in drinks. Where is there a law in the Torah prohibition that a man should not become drunk in the presence of others? For instance, he says there is no specific injunction in the Torah against gluttony as such, overindulgence in food, in drinks. Where is there a law in the Torah prohibition that a man should not become drunk in the presence of others? There is no law, a single prohibition in the Torah enjoining man from being filthy and so forth. If this is the case, so why is being drunk dishonorable? Why is being filthy this honorable ignominious, if this is the case? So the answer is simple. There are in the Torah two kinds of commandments, specific commandments and general commandments. There is no specific commandment prohibiting drunkenness or gluttony or overindulgence or bad manners or filth. But there is a general commandment. Which one is the general commandment? G'deshim tiyu lalekechem. Only the general rule of G'deshim tiyu enjoins the Jew from doing anything which is morally and even aesthetically and judged in purely human values and terms reprehensible and offensive. Halachic morality is subsumed according to the Gemara in Satan, according to the Rambam, under the general commandment not of G'deshim tiyu. This is the opinion of the Rambam. But according to the Rambam, the Gemara in Satan, and the Gemara in Shabbos, and the Sifri, under the general commandment of what? Halachic morality. V'olachto b'trochov. Imitat yodei. Follow in the footsteps of your Lord and Master. My mind has stated this in his days, and he said, Kach lomdu b'firush mitzvah zu, mahu nikro rachanun afato yechanun, mahu nikro rachum afato yerachum, mahu nikro kodesh afato yekodesh. Even as God is called gracious, so be thou gracious. Even as he is called merciful, so be thou merciful. Even as he is called holy, so be thou holy. However, there is a fundamental difference between the specific commandments of the formal halacha, this matter and formal halacha, and the halachic moral behavior and halachic morality. In my opinion, there is a twofold distinction between formal halacha and moral halacha, or halacha of morality, or the halachic morality better. First, the area of the specific halachic norm was precisely circumscribed. Its fulfillment is a well-defined and clearly qualified affair. All elements are enumerated, the minutiae spelled out. It commences the halachic mitzvah act, the religious performance in accordance with a specific amendment, commences and terminates at certain times with the initiation and consummation of definitive actions, like the mitzvah of tefillah, or the mitzvah of sukkah, or lulav, or shofar, or kriyas shema, or megillah, or chanukah, or Shabbos. One must not add nor subtract from the prescribed elements of a mitzvah. You know, l'sigra memenu, l'sisifola. It is not up to the doer to judge the matter intuitively and to act at random. He simply must comply with the formal rules and meet technical halachic standards. The halacha is detail conscious, very detail conscious. The same performance done 5 minutes sooner carries weight. If postponed, it is rendered void enough. The Masorah, or rather the tradition, by virtue of which these norms have been handed down through the ages, is an intellectual one. The laws pertaining, for instance, to tefillin and the techniques which must be employed if one is eager to respond to the norm were strictly handed down strictly handed down in detail by our sages and ancestors. Any halachic controversy, a machlekes, pertaining to the specific norm, we have many machlekes, many controversies, to Rabbi Kiva, Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Yechon, Rish Lakish, and Bisham, and Beis Hillel, was resolved and a decision reached. Halachik Beis Hillel, halachik Rabbi Kiva Mechaveri, Le Mechaverov, even controversies between Rishonim, among Rishonim, who were resolved between Tfil Rashi and Rabbi Netam. Of course, we've accepted, you all know very well, the viewpoint of Rashi. Even though there are Hasidim, or Hasidim Shemaise, who also, are meticulous about laying the Tfilin of Rabbi Netam as well. But basically, fundamentally, Tfilin of Rashi, who were accepted, even though very strange. The new excavations of which has exposed many documents, and many scrolls, and even tefillin of the first century, have confirmed Shittas Rabbi Netam. But as I said before, we are not sociologists, we certainly are not archaeologists, we don't care about it. But the Masorah is defined like a science in equations and laws. No doubts, no fluctuations, no equivocal statements. Everything is clearly defined and formulated. And what rules supreme in the formal halacha is the institution of authority, the concept of authority. Vested either in Chachmei Chazal or in Rishonim or in Gdei Yisrael, whose authority was accepted by the Klal Yisrael. You see, halachic morality is different. A halachic morality has not been concisely defined. You don't have a Shulchan Aruch. Attempts of experiment, people were experimenting with it. One of those who experimented with halachic morality, you know who of the last generation, Chofetz Chaim. Chofetz Chaim experimented with formulating not formal halacha, but halachic morality, or crystallizing halacha morality into code. I wouldn't say that he succeeded too well. His Mishnah Brura in the Sefer HaKochim are by far superior to the Chofetz Chaim and Ahavas Chesed. Yeah. And many more have experimented, tried to do so. But somehow halachic morality does not lend itself to codification. Cannot be crystallized into the form of a code. You know why? Somehow you don't have halachas. For instance, modesty, humility is a central concept in halacha. For the Ramluchas days speaks of humility as the basic virtue among all the virtues, moral virtues in Judaism. But you don't have a book discussing humility as the Christians have the 4 steps of humility by what's his name, by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. We don't have such books. It's up to the individual to decide how to be humble, and how to manifest humility, and how to be modest. Nothing has been imposed upon him. Nothing has been foisted upon him. You should act in accordance with this rule, technical rule. The general principle was formulated, but not the details. You know why? You know why it is so? Because morality cannot be foisted upon someone. It flows from a deep-seated sense of sanctity, which the redeemed personality discovers within himself. And if we speak of freedom in halacha, here is the domain where freedom reigns supreme. freedom and progress and expansion and ascent. There is no fixity as far as halachic morality is concerned, the way we think of the specifics. The Torah did not impose the specifics of morality upon a person, because in such an event it would cease to be morality and fall back to formal halacha, to the state of formal halacha. The element of freedom is indispensable within the moral world. There must be an inner urge to hallow and sanctify one's existence, to redeem oneself through the moral gesture. And this inner urge gives birth to the halachic code. But each individual has his own subjective halachic code, his own halachic shulchan aruch. I knew many Gdolei Israel, as far as Esrig and Lulev and Shefer and Sukkah and prayer and Kriyas HaTorah and Achilas Matzo and Tefillin and Tzitzis are concerned. They acted, their actions were standardized. However, as far as their moral behavior is concerned, each one acted in his unique, singular fashion. Each one stressed a certain virtue, a different virtue. Each one acted in compliance with the demands of his heart and his soul. And the individual uniqueness and singularity, which is the greatest gift which God has bestowed upon man, comes to expression in the most grand and beautiful manner in the world of morality, in the halacha. The how cannot be predicated. It must be involved spontaneously by the moral person who finds the norm within himself. It's quite doubtful whether two individuals have discovered in their hearts, in the inner recesses of their personality, the same morality or the same moral code. For a genuine morality is at the bottom an exclusively personal affair. And paraphrasing William James, it is a vision rather than a conception. He said it with reference to something else. That's why Yahadus, which is very meticulous about all minutiae of the formal halachic act as to time and place and technical consummation and performance, did not exercise his authority and did not define morality in the form of a code. There is a general precept of morality, imitatio Dei, which demands from man to follow in the footsteps of divinity. However, the how, the method, was entrusted entirely to each individual. This is the first difference between formal halacha and halachic morality. There is a second difference also. And the second difference concerns the character of Masorah. Whereas the formal halacha, halachic Masorah, was a public one, and is still a public one. It's a public Masorah. It is forged in the halls of study, in the Batei HaMidrash, in the yeshivas, in the houses of learning and scholarship. The moral Masorah is a private, intimate one, which is realized in the relationship between Rav and Talmid. As a matter of fact, the medium of the moral Masorah is not the word. Of the formal Masorah is the word. Teaching employs the word as the instrument of explanation. But of the moral Masorah is not the word. but living action. Morality is not didactic, but an inspirational affair. The master does not teach, but influences. The pupils do not grasp morality. The pupil does not grasp morality with his mind, but perceives it with his heart. He absorbs it by osmosis. Morality, like a disease, is communicable, and it communicates spontaneously from Rav to Talmud, from master to disciple. Our sages, as far as the moral behavior was concerned, were shy and modest and reticent. They were hermits, lonely creatures. They never exhibited their virtues. They never told their pupils how to be modest and how to act generously and how to behave with dignity and pride and responsibility. The pupils, as we know from many passages in the Gemara, who were spying on their masters. Omar Rabbi Akiva, Pamachas Nichnasti, Achre Rabbi Lezer Lebeis HaKisei, to study modesty in such a place. Because modesty is not to be displayed in public, but to be experienced concerning the most intimate performances on the part of the human being. They followed them miraculously, incessantly. They heed and watched them clandestinely. They tried to learn by observing the intimate gesture of morality in which their masters engaged in their lonely and private world, not knowing that someone was eavesdropping or observing them. You will ask me why such a message? Why not preach a philosophy of morals as Christianity did? Why not formulate morality in clear, precise, and concise terms? Why not write books on ethics the way philosophers, Spinoza and Kant and Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle did? Why not? Why were we so shy about morality? Morality is handed down by example, by action, in the privacy of the home, in the darkness of the night, in the loneliness of the intimate relationship between I and the Tao. Why? The answer is simple, may Rabbi say. For God himself, who is the source of morality, an imitation of his ways, is the general norm out of which morality flows. Himself, God himself, abideth under the shadow of transcendence and dwelleth in the shelter of infinity and anonymity. Moses begged God, who is wrapped in mystery, in the cloud of unknowability, Areini no drochecho veideo. If I have found favor in thy eyes, let me know how thy ways, that I may know thee. What was his answer? His prayer accepted? No. His hope did not come true. Vayeret ad Hashem be'onon. God went down in a cloud. The mysterium tremendum, inapproachable and unintelligible. And Moses had to probe in awe and in fear, search and explore creation in order to discover the fingerprints of his maker, the footstep of his maker. Moses and so men must spy on God in order to discover his morality. Because if one doesn't spy on him, if one doesn't eavesdrop on him, if one doesn't observe him clandestinely, you don't see him, you don't find him. The cloud separates us from him. And you know what a cloud is. What is the cloud? The mechanical natural law, the mathematical equation, the automatic performance on the part of nature. But you have to penetrate nature in order to get to the great beyond where morality rules supreme. He never reveals his moral code to man. Man has to search for it and actually conquer it, wrest it from the hands of God. And beautiful is the Maimar Chazal, that when the Jews have made a golden calf, so the luches, half of the luches were in the hands of God, and the other third, one third was in the hands of God, and the other third was in the hands of Moses. And Moses, almost by force, wrested the luches out of the hands of God. What does it mean? We try simply to find him in spite of the fact that God is hiding. Kamti ani lifteach ledeidi, deidi choma kovale. Eichen holar deidi ayofa banoshim, uvakshem evo. And Merai Rabbi say, you are tired, I'm perhaps also tired. I want just to address one message to you. The moral posture of the Orthodox Rabbi is of paramount importance for our survival. I said previously that the great controversy between us and our ideological opponents, adversaries, will be resolved at intellectual level. I must qualify now my statement by saying that intellectual supremacy, no matter how important, alone will not bring victory. The moral position of the traditional rabbi will determine as much as, and perhaps more than, than intellectual excellence. For morality is invested with saintliness, or I would rather say with the divine spark. And the latter, saintliness, contains the element of fascination. Is uniquely attractive. Morality, is the moral personality, is uniquely attractive. It is an object of search and yearning, and allures even the skeptic, and the agnostic, and the atheist, and the cynic, with potent charm, I would say with irresistible charm. If the Orthodox rabbi will display humility, instead of taking pride in his moral excellence, in modesty, in generosity, in Avas Yisrael, in commitment to ideals, if he will refrain from supervising the religiosity and the piety of other rabbis, and stop and from criticizing others who are sometimes much better than he is and superior to him in many regards, and instead engage a little bit in introspection and self-examination and a chesed nefesh, if you pray with zeal and warmth and help others and be kind and generous, then the people will follow him, for no one can resist the magnetic quality of the moral personality. Whenever the Jews rebelled in the desert and assumed a threatening pose Vida wie Moshe and Aaron. The Pasuk tells us that the glory of God appeared in the cloud. ויקדבר הארן על כל הדז מישראל, ויפנו אל המדבר, ונקבית עד השם נראה בעונן. The mere confrontation with God had a soothing, calming effect upon agitated minds, upon a rebellious crowd, and brought them back to their senses. They realized their base and dishonorable behavior, and not only the glory of God has a soothing, stabilizing, inspiring, redeeming effect upon the crowd, but also the glory of the moral personality, who reflects the Heid HaShekhinah, has the same effect. And the confrontation with the moral personality is a great experience for all men. And if we are ready to meet the challenge which history has confronted us with at both levels, at the intellectual and the moral level, and I'll emphasize, if we are ready to simply to display a saintly moral quality vis-a-vis the Jewish community, then I have no doubts. Alle nale kinuchalo will emerge triumphant from our engagement with hostile forces.